Hello, welcome to another episode of Beam There, Done That. I'm here joined again with my wonderful co-host, Francesco Cesarini,
Hi there, I'm Francesco, co-host and co-author of Designing for Scalability with Erlang OTP.
and we have a very interesting special guest, Zach Daniel. Maybe Zach, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm the author of Ash Framework, co-author of a book also titled Ash Framework, and I am also a VP of engineering at Remedy Meds.
Yeah, we brought you on
Great.
here to discuss about what you're working on with Ash Framework. Yeah, as an avid user of Ash, I'm super happy to have you on here. I know that you're tired of seeing my messages, asking all kinds of goofy questions, and also reporting lots of bugs. I remember I think you gave me a title on the Discord server like bug hunter or finder or something. So I was actually pretty proud of that.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
honestly, like it's there's so many people who actually just like find issues, have problems, whatever, and they just kind of bounce off, or they sail away, or they work around it. So I'm really happy when people are willing to like communicate the things that they are dealing with, so that we can like fix them for everybody.
Nice, nice, nice. I've got a question I ask, and I think it's a good introductory question. I tend to ask every programming language inventor, and basically it's what problem were you trying to solve when you created Ash?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think like when I created Ash, I was just missing a bunch of stuff that I had before, right? I had worked for like about a maybe year and a half, 2 years building a backend for an ed tech company. And we had built something that kind of would be is quite reminiscent of Ash, to serve our APIs. And it was just like really nice. It had solved so many problems in a way that like when we wanted to do new work, we just would like create some new resources, like configure them, and like boom, job done. And so like our velocity as an engineering organization got faster every week, as opposed to what I've seen many other cases where you get slower every week. And so then I got a new job, and went to work at Dockyard, and I was working on a project, and none of these nice things that I had built were available. um, and I felt like I was kind of like back in the Stone Ages from like an application logic perspective. Like I was writing logic to pull params out of, like for building APIs, to pull like filter params out of the query string, so that I could like and build a query. And then I wanted to load some related data in some. It was just like so manual and so solved. Like I just hate that feeling of like I'm just like rebuilding a solved problem. So really, like the actual thing was like an itch that I needed to scratch for myself, to just stop repeating the same crap over and over and over again, to do like, I don't know, the uninteresting part of what goes into sort of building applications, right? I want to focus on, when I'm building an application layer, I want to focus on the 100 impactful lines of code, the algorithms for our critical business logic, what makes us distinct and unique, the connectors that make us distinct and
Mhm.
unique. And I do not ever want to spend time on like taking an integer properly from like from a JSON body and making sure that it's handled. It's just so uninteresting to me.
So this sounds just like the goals with the first release of OTP. I mean, the first release of OTP came out in 1996, if I remember correctly. And, you know, the definition of OTP, I think, in the airline world and what it is today compared to, the definition and term used in the Elixir world are slightly different. But back then, OTP consisted of three things. One was the virtual machine. So it was at the time it was the Jam, and the Beam was just beginning to make inroads. The second was a set of applications and libraries, which were released as part of OTP and still are today, as part of the main airline release and still are today. And thirdly, a set of system design principles, and those are probably the ones people link to OTP today, which is processes which have particular behaviors. So you'll have your finite state machines, you'll have your client servers, you'll have your supervisors, and you went in and packaged everything into a supervisor tree, and then you package that supervision tree into an OTP application. And your system, would consist of a set of loosely coupled OTP applications, and you ended up reusing probably about 80% of those OTP applications, from project to project. And they would contain APIs, they would contain interfaces towards non-standardized databases. At the time, it was mainly telecoms, so interfaces towards the SMSC. You'd access these interfaces with these applications through an API, through an Erlang-based interface. So that's how they would communicate with each other. So that meant that once you'd done the hard work once, you could deploy a new system, which had your metrics, which had your observability, which had your web framework and your operation and management console, which had external APIs, towards your billing systems and your customer databases and so on. I don't know if this was the analogy of what we had there, and in the end, the new code you produced from one project to another was just maybe 5, 10, 20% of the code base, depending on the complexity. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's really interesting is like the way, okay, so the way you sort of build the application runtime, the actual stateful things that you need to build an application is very different from how you build the business logic definitions of that application, at least in my opinion. And that's a lot of where sort of Ash comes into play. And so what's interesting is like the aims are the same where you build the sort of the way we deal with like beam, the beam and OTP is it's more like a virtual machine. I mean, it is a virtual machine, but it feels more like an operating system that then
Correct. Yeah.
inside of that your application runs. And I think what's really interesting is like in a lot of ways it's the almost entirely opposite of how Ash works, but Ash would only is only functional because it sits on top of the beam. Like I don't actually think that something like Ash can actually succeed without the primitives that make this all sort of work. Like for listeners who are maybe less familiar, like the way Ash works is you essentially define your application, like your business logic, in a set of resources. And in this most basic format, that means maybe if you have a blog, you might have a blog.post resource that says like this is a post in the blog, and a blog.comments resource. It gets like far more in depth than that, but mapping some concept to some state that might live in a database somewhere, and then providing things that you can do with it, which is what we call actions. So you can say you can create a post, and by creating a post, I take these particular fields, and these are the editable fields, and which I think is really interesting. Like it sounds overly simplistic, but you have to kind of dive in to understand that like we actually can extend that way of thinking to pretty much anything that you want to do. But what's really interesting about it is it's stateless. Like Ash itself doesn't start any processes when you actually start the app, right? There are no applications or supervisors required for Ash. But it if you use Ash Postgres, you're heavily relying on DB connection, which manages your connection pooling to like efficiently access a database. If you use Ash JSON API or Ash GraphQL, you're heavily leveraging Phoenix, which uses a process per connection, which is the reason that your Phoenix, like that model is why your Phoenix server scales in a way that pretty much no other web service like or web server tech will scale. Like the process per request plus a preemptive scheduler means like no one request is going to come up the works, all that sort of stuff. And so that's what I think is really interesting is all of the all of the problems that have been solved by the beam allow me as somebody who's building these sort of application design primitives to stack up on those sorts of things. And it's actually like really sort of nice and freeing. I get to see all of those sort of solved problems more than almost anybody else does, because otherwise I'd have to sort of solve them myself as a framework author.
So it almost sounds like you've gone in and you've taken OTP to the next level by adding an abstraction layer, and you're focusing more on the programming model. So you sounds like you've added stateful lambdas and are forcing a certain type of approach when developing, which is very very similar to the approaches we were taking, but without a framework.
It's actually really interesting because like what's in vogue right now, if you look at people talking about building applications with AI, this is like the current sort of moment in the zeitgeist is about adding constraints, right? and I think this is just because what people are finding is that when you just sort of like give, when you start trying to build these large applications in a sort of either LLM driven way or LLM assisted way, if you just give them an empty canvas and a programming language, you get something very, very complicated. You get something very, very hard to understand as a human, which means hard to like wield, 3 months down the road when you have 100,000 lines of code and it's 3 o'clock in the morning and something's on fire. Like what are you gonna do? Like and people are hitting this problem right now, and I think that it's one of those things where Ash doesn't really stop you from doing any particular thing. You really can do, like, you can build. We have these things called generic actions that are just typed inputs, do whatever you want, and then return something. The sort of interesting bit here is what we do is we guide you to like where to put that sort of stuff. So a generic action, like, when you see a generic action, you're like, this is doing something that's more complicated and or special than like a create action, which we know will just produce a record. It's going to write to the database, or it's going to use whatever data layer you're using. And so I think that's what I've seen is so nice about building with Ash is we give you a framework that tells you where everything goes, roughly like where all the special stuff is. So when I go to look at some particular domain model, I can zero in on, this is where I ought to be looking. Everything else is like bog standard, nothing worth sort of really looking that intensely at. So I think that's a big part of what we do is giving you like a way to think about these things that isolates the complexity into specific obvious locations.
What's the biggest challenge to adoption?
It's an interesting question because I legitimately think that like the if you kind of take a step back, the biggest challenge to adoption is actually Elixir's adoption, not really Ash's adoption, right? There's some subset of the Elixir community that's interested in Ash. Maybe I think the percentage is rising, but maybe like 10% of people building sort of business applications are using Ash, these days, right? Just kind of winging that number, but based on my experience going to conferences and talking with people and our Discord server and downloads and stuff, I would say like, 5 to 10% of like new business apps use Ash. Again, pull that number out of nowhere. But for me, I don't know if I care to try to like scrap and scramble for that like other 90% within Elixir, like that much, really. I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of people. They don't, either they're convinced that they don't need something like Ash, or they've been burned by things like Ash before. That's a really common one. And I don't know. I don't really like trying to convince people to use Ash. Like, I don't mind talking about the concepts. I do enjoy that very much and like sharing. But so ultimately, I'm more concerned with like increasing Elixir's overall adoption. And I actually think that Ash is a mechanism for that, right? So Ash is the only framework for Elixir that comes with a React installer. Like, there's like with a TypeScript. So we have a thing called Ash TypeScript, which basically gives you a free client library, like an RPC client library, so that you can use React with your Ash application. So, and we use this at my company that I work at. Whenever we add an action, like let's say you want to have like an action to create a post is another example, and you say it accepts like the post title and you literally just type one command, and you have a client library that is now available in TypeScript to our front end developers to use, fully typed. You can load related data, you can filter, you can sort, you can do paginate, all that sort of stuff, and we just get that sort of thing for free. So anyway, I think the real thing is Elixir adoption, and I'm actually more interested these days in how I can use Ash to increase Elixir adoption, as opposed to trying to sort of fight for the people who are aware of it and don't care about it. I'm good. They don't have to use it. No big deal.
That's actually quite interesting. I just wanted to have a little caveat on this one. I had somebody actually come and shadow me, which shadowing a programmer, I mean, it depends, because we don't exactly do the most interesting things. Sometimes we're just staring at code for the longest time. She just sat next to me and I was trying to explain what I'm doing and explain my thought process and stuff like that. And I asked her, why do you want to get into this? She said, I want to be able to make my own websites, my own whatever. And so I said, okay, let me show you Ash. I didn't say Ash, right? I said, let me show you. And I showed her with Ash. I showed her an action, a policy, the pagination. So in like half a day, she actually had a form working, all the stuff. She's never done HTML, never done CSS, never done any kind of programming at all. She is a high school student that's just about to graduate. And just half a day from like the 3 days she shadowed me, she came home with a website that I forgot what it was, but it was very simple CRUD. And she was so excited. And she was like, this is so easy. I understand everything that I'm doing because of the DSL. And because of course I
Yeah.
walked you through it, but I think the DSL itself is pretty much self-explanatory. So I can definitely say that
Y-
has actually driven adoption of Elixir. And also, sorry, one more thing too. I do have another little anecdote. My business partner is a French guy. He did a lot of Java for many years. Hated it. We decided to go in business together. I added him on as a partner to my company. He's got a very good business sense compared to me, much better than me. He did a lot, like I said, did a lot of Java. And the thing he told me at the beginning, he said, "Listen, Alan, I want to tell you something. I do not want to code ever. I am not going to code. I hate it. I do not want to deal with it." I showed him Ash, and now he's coding every single day. And he says, "Actually, I love programming again." Like I know it sounds like a made up story. It sounds like I'm trying to like make you feel better, but it's actually what happened to us. And the policies, the field policies, this stuff is like it's a godsend. All right, so I just want to say that I think Ash can be that candidate because I've actually seen it happen twice.
it's really interesting because I do think there's a lot of reasons that people program, right? And there's a lot of reasons that it's fun to program or rewarding. And I've seen both ends of the spectrum and enjoyed both ends of the spectrum fully. So sometimes I write code and I'm trying to like make something like the program itself is the aim. And Ash in a lot of ways has been that for me many times, right? Where I am trying to make something possible in the real world, but it's kind of abstract, right? So a good example, like Ash calculations, on the face of them seem very simple. Let's say you have like a user, you want to have like a full name calculation. So you write a calculation that says it's the first name plus a space plus the last name, right? There's a huge amount of depth in the way that Ash calculations work. We solve complex like divergent dependencies amongst different calculations. We can load some of them in memory and some of them in the data layer. We can go like multiple turns if we have to. So like if some have to be computed in the database and some have to be computed from a set of calculations that were done in the database, then we'll do them in memory. It's extremely complex, and that code, getting that working, and I guess reasonably elegant, is extremely rewarding. Like it's what I would suggest actually makes me like not excited about the whole AI movement these days, is that I feel like I have fewer and fewer reasons to do that really fun type of programming. But the other type of programming is you're trying to make a change in the world, right? Like you're using the code as a tool to accomplish some other thing where that is really the aim. And to me, Ash feels not so good for people who are they really want to write code. Like the thing that they're trying to do is program. But it feels really good for people who have a different aim. They're trying to build something, and the code is a stepping stone or a building block for the aim in the real world that they have. And we found that especially true when Ash was sort of younger, that like mid-level engineers were often they didn't like it because it didn't feel like writing code, like what they had learned how to do in college. And that's what they were just getting into the swing of being able to do, is to write the fun code, write the cool code, right? I was, they were the ones who were going to be writing these complex subsystems that can filter API endpoints or whatever. Like I'm just using that as a classic example of something that Ash just sort of solves for you. And we found that they kind of are like, it almost felt boring to them because they wanted to write code. They weren't necessarily looking to accomplish a business goal. So I would say like there's a lot of different sort of aims, and especially for like business people where Ash is making something accessible that wasn't accessible before, it's a really good feeling because it's really good at that. It's really good at getting out of your way and helping you build something that was more ambitious than you could have handwritten. And I think that's something that I've kind of had to come to terms with, is that sometimes Ash isn't fun because it's business in a way. It's an end goal, a reality thing that you're trying to accomplish, and that's just kind of the nature of it.
It almost sounds like you're pushing, both graduates and mid-level engineers out of their comfort zone. At least this is something I've seen in the Erlang world a lot, that not having been exposed, to the problems Ash solves makes it very hard to appreciate.
Yeah, I think that's very true. It's the same kind of identity crisis that people are having with AI these days, where I kind of hate using the word AI, but it's what everybody calls it. There's the closing gap between how hard it was to accomplish something, like that sort of difficulty closing means that you're actually constantly solving business problems, or
Mhm.
you're constantly solving people problems, and less time, let you spend less time solving programming problems. And so I think it's really just it's kind of an interesting corollary. Like I was dealing with that before AI, where I was kind of making everybody having to be a sort of product engineer because they couldn't justify spending 40 hours on one individual API endpoint or something like that. It just doesn't work that way anymore. It was too easy to do that. So you have to keep moving on to new business problems because you're solving them faster. Which I think is funny because for business people is wildly exciting. Like for anybody who's trying to accomplish a real thing in the world, you love that. You're like, wait, what do you mean I'm done? Like that,
Well,
I don't know. It's like an addicting loop in reality.
no, it's a huge productivity boost. I mean that's what you do is you let go of the control, but you get a huge increase in productivity, and that's what the business people see. I suspect a good part of the programmers who are not adopting it are not adopting it because they don't have that level of granularity of control they need and
Yeah.
that they're used to having.
I think that's the other bit I wish I could explain to people like that. If we talk about barriers to adoption, that's kind of a big one, which is the way Ash works. Like, so all those people who feel, oh, I've been burned by adopting X abstraction in the past. So, I don't know, Spring Boot, Active Record, Django, whatever. It doesn't matter. Then they're like, that didn't go that well for me. I I feel the same way, and I built something that I felt on balance did not have that problem. Like sometimes you will experience something like that, but it's like we talk about this like progressive complexity disclosure in a way where you use a simple create action and then you're like actually I need to do something special. There's a like it's like all a bunch of stacked things. And sometimes you have to rewrite a little bit of your code. You're like, oh, you know what? I can't use a create action for this. I got to use a generic action, or I can't use a change, which people who are familiar with Asheville know this. I can't just plug in a change because I need to take over the whole life cycle. So, but the thing is, it's like built for that. The control really is still there. It really is there. And I think that that's something that once you get comfortable with it, it's not so bad, which is you like accepting that you use the best fit tool for the job because it's so easy to iterate on these things. Just use a basic action. And then you're like, I need something more complicated. So I'm going to go step up one layer. I'm going to move that logic over. Right. Like it's a good experience for some, but for others, when you ever hit the moment, you know what, I need to rework this because the abstraction I chose doesn't perfectly fit the problem, and I have some limitation now. They ever have that experience, and they get sort of like a PTSD of like locked into the thing, and they're like, I don't ever want to experience that again. So I haven't figured out how to explain to people that you really can do anything you want. Like you can graduate
Mhm.
from all the way from some like pre-built chunks of business logic up to just a typed interface where you can step all the way out to whatever you want, but I don't begrudge them. I get it. I understand why you would kind of not want to be locked in. And I also get that some people just don't feel like they need it. Like they're like, I can do anything I want. Like Elixir is good enough. I have built everything under the sun with it. I don't need anybody to help me or to structure this in any meaningful way.
I'm using it every single day. I've actually forgotten how to use straight ecto and things like that after some time, which is probably not good. But I was just using it today. Like I just removed my previous SaaS accounting, and I'm just building my own like accounting system. I just import all the data, so right now I actually be able to just create a PDF, and that actually helped a lot because I needed to. I'm using this thing called Types, TYPST. I'm not sure if you've ever heard it before. It's like a templating language, sort of like LaTeX or LaTeX. I'm not
Yep.
sure how you say it. Yeah, I needed to be able to put a decimal into a string, and so I was like, I'll just write a calculation, simple, And then I just used fragment from Postgres to just turn into a string. It was just dead simple. Like I felt like okay, that's kind of hacky, but at the same time, it's much easier than having to do it outside in code. It feels almost a little bit more hacky if you do it that way. So yeah, I've been super
Yeah.
happy with it. I honestly, as I said before, I would love to kind of talk a little bit about policies and field policies because those are two of the most awesome features of. I think I kind of consider them to be like the two, maybe like two out of three pillars of Ash that I think you should use it if you actually know what it is. Do you mind to kind of introduce what those are and what makes them so powerful?
Yeah. In Ash, you sort of contain business logic. 90% of the time, that looks like access to some store. So like a like data layer, which means also for 90% of the time it means you're abstracting a Postgres database table. It's not a limitation of Ash. Like you can do anything you want, but that's if we're obviously going to optimize for that use case because that's what we're doing 90% of the time is controlling access to and managing and deriving things from like an interface to a database table. If we want to do that, let's say we want to tell you, here, here's an action that can, let's say, create an invoice, for example, or what's a better example? Yeah, let's say you want to. For now, let's say you want to create a blog post and you want to be able to like see all of, everybody should be able to see all public blog posts, but not, private blog posts, for example, unless they're your own blog posts, and then you can't see them because they're private, right? If we want to kind of properly abstract like the internal, like the interface for doing these things, you're either, without something built into the resource interface itself, you're going to have to like write all of that sort of logic. You're going to have to hand roll it. So you might have like a create post function, and you're going to say, well, the author ID has to be the current user's author ID, otherwise you can't make a post for somebody else, right? Which, by the way, is a really common like a common thing people get wrong. Like they forget to check that the references that you're using are things you actually have access to. Anyway, and then you also, when you have like you're gonna have like a read posts function that's supposed to that's gonna say, well, okay, either filter it, the query where it says such that either they're my posts or they are public posts, for example. I think that in policies and authorization logic are a great example of something that are domain rules that we often build in a way that we get very little reuse out of them. They only perform one function in one place, and policies are the exact sort of thing that you need to be sure are applied like everywhere. You need to you need to there's a huge obvious required mindset that, well, if somebody goes and creates another function to create a post, they have to factor that in too. Like it's policy logic is one of the biggest drivers to centralization in an application in general, because that's the whole thing. Is you're like, well, I need to make sure everything goes through this one thing where I write the logic that describes who can do what and why. When we look at that, look at it from that lens, Ash actually, we build, you kind of realize we need to centralize all these rules. So Ash puts on the resource level a concept of policies. And policies describe who can do what, and by what conditions, but they describe them in a declarative way that allows us to reuse them for a lot of different things. So a really simple example is, let's say, we can embed this sort of example of, I can read my own posts or I can read posts that are public. So you would write a policy on the resource. That policy would say, if the action type is read, I guess should I, I know you guys said that I can share my screen. Should I like write code? I don't know. Are people going to be able to
Yeah, you
follow along in
can.
the audio
Yeah,
version?
absolutely, absolutely.
All right, let me pull up a text editor, and we'll take a look. Also using Igniter, another thing of my own. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if the code is like coming through in the window that I'm seeing here properly, but like if you are seeing all of it
You
or
can
not.
see. You should be able to see what's being broadcast. I think there's some of it being cut off a little
Okay
bit.
then.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's give up on it, because I think it's going to take too much time for me to figure it out. In the example that I was giving, if you have a policy that states that you would write a policy in the resource that states like when the action type is read. So when you're trying to get data out of this resource, then you would say authorize if the post is public, and then you'd say authorize if it's my post. And that's like the entirety of the logic that you need to enforce the rules about authorization across your like every usage of this resource. And what I mean by that is, if you just do a basic read, it will filter out everything you can't see. Like if you just say give me all the posts for this user, like with this actor, that's how is the terminology, it automatically filters all that data. If you were to attempt to, let's say you have like a filter from another resource, you want to say give me users who have a post titled what's up, we will auto filter in the joining logic to like give you those users. We will automatically apply the rules for reading the target resource. So what that means is, you will actually produce a filter that says give me users who have a post that is public, or where the post is my post, where the title equals what's up. So, and we build all that, like that just happens. You don't even have to think about it. And at this also, if you were to do like a bulk update, if you were to say update all posts where, to set public equals true, we would automatically filter for the post you're like to, well, only posts that you can see, that where, that where would you make that update on. And we do the same thing even for field policies. So there's a thing called a field policy that determines, it's just field visibility. Field writing is a little bit, you want to do that in like a slightly different way. But field policies say, let's say there's a social security number, right, on, which I mean, it probably shouldn't be just like stored plain text, but let's just say there's a social security number, and you want to say like you're the only person who can see the social security number. If, when we're building a filter, you were to say give me all users where the social security number equals whatever, we actually change that reference to include the policies around the fields that you reference. So you would say, give me all of the users where the social security number equals, if it's me, then the social security number, otherwise null. So we like magically apply all of these rules to solve for, it's like so many problems around building applications, just like transparently, it just happens for you, and you can feel confident that it's applied everywhere that needs to be applied. And this is actually something like, I go to any application that has filterable API endpoints, and one of two things is true. Either they don't allow filtering on a whole host of fields because it would be insecure to allow doing that. This is or they're vulnerable to an attack, like an enumeration attack. So a good example of this is like, let's say you have like an ed tech platform that has like students and their addresses. There's a lot of cases where if I make a request to an API endpoint and I say, give me all the students who live in this state, if I get a 403 back, I know that there is a student who lives in that state, but I can't see them. And if I get a 404 back, then that means like there are no students in that state. And then I can say, okay, give me the students who live in this county, or with this email, with this phone number, whatever it is, right? And I can enumerate, and to eventually like actually find, like a student's name and a student's address, for example. So we just solve all that sort of stuff for you. You just write the policies, literally like 4 lines of code, and every possible usage access is covered.
What is the light bulb moment you've observed in developers basically demonstrates and shows that they finally get it, that they understand how to use policies, how to bypass them, and and that they've reached a point where they're actually leveraging the power of the whole Ash framework?
It's an interesting point. Like the light bulb moment that I typically see is actually like way more sort of deeper down, when we describe, like when people kind of get how it works as a concept, right? So not necessarily even around policies themselves, but Ash is really just modeling your own application as data. And I don't mean like data in a database, but what I mean is like a resource is just a big map of data. It just creates the thing where I can say, give me all the attributes, give me all the policies, give me all the actions, right? And then Ash provides a bunch of pre-built code that knows what to do with that. Like when you say go create one of these things, it's just interpreting the data structure. There's really far less magic than one might expect. I'm going to go look at the action. They said they want to create a post with the create post action. And I'm going to say, okay, well, what does it accept? And this is how Ecto works too, right? For a lot of things, we just take that like that much further. So once they start to realize that they're just describing something and nothing actually happens when they do it, right? They're not really writing code. They're writing like Elixir flavored JSON or whatever. Then it starts to fall into place that the working pattern is use the description language that Ash provides, this domain specific language. Then you figure out, well, how is it applied, right? Then you read some documentation, you sort of understand, okay, this is where this particular piece of knowledge is used. And that is the seed for like really understanding the value of all of the various bits and bobs, is that this is just a data structure that you're building.
I have one last question, and then I'll throw the ball over to Alan again. What is the hello world of the Ash framework? How would someone who wants to start using it get up and running and get something working end to end?
It's actually pretty easy to do, because on our website, go to ash-hq.org, there is an installer, and that installer lets you pick from like any of the packages that we have and create a new app with all of those things, right? So if you're looking at something really basic, if you want to build an API, you can just select, I just need the API bit. But you also can select, like you can get an AI, like a chat enabled app, like something where you can chat with your app. That's literally one extra button click, which is to add Ash AI. And you can go to find like a basic resource, like make a resource, like literally if you're just trying to poke around, make a resource called, blog.post, and make a resource called like, blog.comment, and make something where you can comment on a blog. Like it doesn't, that part doesn't really matter. The part is like seeing some of the moving pieces. But because of the way everything worked, like the way we have all of these different packages that all sort of connect together and all know how Ash Core itself actually does its job, you can go from that to like an AI blog post writer, where it can create blog posts for you on your blog in like sub 15 minutes, because you just add the Ash AI package, you with an installer or that you installed from the beginning, and then you say, and the tools that it has are that it can create blog posts and read blog posts. Boom, job done. You have an AI blog post author, right? Like I think that's kind of the real thing is like seeing how much you can just layer on top of what you're building.
The AI stuff is actually really interesting because I think now is different, but I remember when people kept talking about, okay, I'm going to hook AI into my system, give it access to this and that. I'm like, wait a minute. If nobody around me when they were talking about this was actually really talking about how much information to give. As an accountant, I should only care about the accounting stuff and not like personnel information. This is an example, right? And these kinds of
Yep.
examples, these kinds of situations, and you have a very, I think it's your most recent in terms of like popular packages, which is Ash AI, and you take advantage of the policies, which is I think one of the things that I thought was like really really powerful. Of course, as I said 10,000 times already, policies in Ash are powerful, and the fact that you leverage them when you can use your Ash AI is even better, right? Because you're saying, okay, as going back to my example, as an accountant, tell me, like all of the people's secret information. No, you don't have access to that, but I can tell you like what's your P&L. That I think
Yeah,
is super powerful.
totally. I think like AI is a great example of one of those things where we just sort of got that for free, like really early on out of the gate, because every interface in Ash, every action is typed, and the rules of whether like what you can and can't use actions are defined. And so, literally, that we had people going on these like big endeavors to expose parts of their application to an AI agent, and then to restrict access in such a way that made it safe to give to their users. Where with Ash AI, you just pick the actions that you want to be available to the agent. And then when you load up the chat page, you make sure that like you've set a current user and everything, and if you don't, then the agent won't be able to do anything, right? But if you do, then all everything will be automatically scoped to what that user is allowed to do. And so it's just safe. It's safe to just, smack some AI on it. You still have to think a little bit like, even though I'm allowed to delete, like as a user, maybe I'm allowed to delete things, you probably shouldn't put the delete tool in there, or you should build like a confirmation workflow or something like that. So it doesn't like fully offload your thinking because there are things that people are allowed to do but shouldn't really do very often. But it does at least, you're never going to leak data. You're never going to have a situation where you like, set up your AI chatbot and it just like leaks data that the user shouldn't know about, unless you have something wrong with your policy model, in which case like that's the layer where you would fix that sort of thing. And we've actually seen this, Losh with Goatmeyer. He built a conference management tool with Ash. He's been using Ash a lot for a lot of things recently, and he wanted to set it up in such a way that he could work on the site on the go using Claude. And so what he did is he set up Ash AI with like an MCP server, and so he could like edit the content of the blog itself, or like edit the training material that's available like literally from his phone. If I recall correctly, it's like set up on his phone or maybe on his laptop, but like it's just free. Honestly, it's so easy by comparison to other tools that like I thought that was going to be the aha moment for a lot of people. It's like, wow, you mean I could just get AI enabled apps for free? But it's just hard to get people, get people to that point, I guess.
I did want to kind of go back to something that I'm going to hit you with a little bit of a tough question, only because you have it too easy right now. Right? We keep stroking your ego. I think I want to hit you with this little tough one, and I've asked you this question before, but I think it's good to kind of break it out there. As I said before, I was somebody who found a lot of bugs. I mean, there's always going to be bugs in software, right? But I feel like I found quite a few bugs. I'm not so sure if it's an issue of people not using the software or using the methods that I've used. I think that when you wrote the book, or when Rebecca, I think mostly wrote the book, and she was using the framework, she probably found some more things that were not quite right, or maybe the API implementation, things like that. How are you handling this? Because the thing is, I give you a lot of leeway because I understand building this framework, building all this stuff, it takes a lot of effort, and running tests for all that stuff, it takes a lot of time, and you have to kind of choose: should I build out a feature, or should I harden what I have, or can we discuss a little bit about that? Because I think that's quite important, because it there is, it's still in flux, right? And overall it's pretty good, but I think it's good to kind of tackle this topic.
Yeah, no, it's worth kind of touching on, because it's been really interesting. Like I know how you solve that problem, right? So we've had, yeah, plenty of people have hit on bugs, and Ash itself, because of how it is built and how it works, will always have like more bugs in it than like a library that does like where you kind of like call some like relatively well specified functions and to achieve some outcome, right? And I think that we've kind of shifted over time to like the reasoning, early on, like the truth is there are like economics at play here, which is not really like the best way to phrase it, but like I have a finite amount of time and I legitimately do not believe that it is in my user's best interest for me to spend the time up front to ensure to do the heavy lifting on every single possible angle of everything that could go wrong before I ship something that adds like a good amount of value, right? Because generally speaking, I would say this: the bugs in Ash are like if there is a bug, it's like a sort of deterministic bug. Like you would find it when you were testing with something. You wouldn't just it's not like you call you do an action once and then the second time it doesn't work. You know what I mean? So there's an aspect for where I have to sometimes make a judgment call of like how rigorous do I want to be when like the happy path of this is working well, and we tested a couple of the edge cases and et cetera. Generally speaking, like this is an open source like community project and there are thousands of community members. It doesn't feel great for any individual person to like hit that bug, but it's kind of like a necessary thing. Like I don't like test in production. I test these things. We write tests. We do all this stuff. But it's just sort of like the real like there's some realism there where like I can release something that will work for like 90% of people, and if anything doesn't work, like I'll find out about it and I'll fix it, and that's like part of the loop, right? But I think the other thing is we're talking about is like why something like Ash is more likely to have bugs than something else. The aspect there's a couple things. One, Ash is more of like it kind of is your app in a lot of ways, right? Which means you aren't picking these like surgical sort of code paths and then checking that they work, and when they don't, you don't just sort of use a different function, or like there's an aspect of that, right? But like if ecto, like if you look at like an ecto release or even an elixir release, right, like there are bugs and they find them, but every time you hit one, it's much more like sort of the problem is much more consolidated into like some particular function you would call. You can just go around it, whereas Ash is building this like multiplicative effect, right? So everything, when we have policies and validations and changes and notifiers and Ash Open and all these things, they all plug in to every other thing. And so what that means is the combinatorics there are like wild, right? The amount of different ways that you can use Ash when everything's like sort of interlinked and built to work together is like practically infinite, right? And so you're almost sort of like guaranteed, and I've been so surprised by this myself as well, but you're guaranteed to walk a path nobody else walked, if that makes sense, because the way that it works, it's like an integrated ecosystem of plugins and extensions and tools. And so it's just sort of like the nature of the beast to some degree that like you probably will find a bug and you'll probably report it. You'll get it fixed really quickly and we'll sort of roll forward. But it's just what happens when the model is about building like an ecosystem or like a system of correctly interconnected components. Is it like like sometimes a bug way deep down in this one little tiny spot affects like your API interfaces over here, and it's like by design that it works that way, but it just means that we sometimes have to like we sometimes, I don't know, the impact of a bug in one tiny little place can affect more things. And so it's just sort of it's kind of the nature of the beast in reality. And I think it's temporal also. So over time, we dramatically have improved that issue, that situation. And it's just by now the framework is much more stable than it ever has been. We're not making changes at the same rate that we have been. And so everything gets, regression tests, and we have a much deeper testing story than we ever did before. And so I think that dramatically the rate of bugs has dropped over time, but it's still just like the nature of the beast, I think, when you're building something like Ash.
It sounds like it's a lot of kind of edge and borderline conditions which get triggered.
I mean, to Alan's point, sometimes somebody reports a bug, and I'm like, how on earth is like how does that particular piece of code not work? Because that seems like something everybody would be using, right? But I think in reality, there's a lot of like it may not be an edge, but it's just the same thing. It's like a Rubik's cube. How many different positions of a Rubik's cube there are? It's like that some of these things like they just didn't affect anybody, or they didn't like notice that it worked that way because they weren't sort of using that particular invariant of of logic. So I think it is edge cases, but to Alan's point, sometimes I'm amazed where somebody will say like this like really basic thing is subtly wrong, and it just kind of blows my mind. But I think it's just yeah, it's the math of it.
I just have one more thing too. I'm also
Yeah.
guilty. I submitted something to Ash Phoenix about assigning temporarily like some stuff. I forgot. I submitted something, and it was broken to begin with, and nobody complained about it. And I'm like, wait a minute. Even I wasn't actually using it after I submitted it, and I'm like, wait a minute, this code is actually broken. And I didn't write a test, and it got accepted, right? And I think that's probably you guys trusted me, which you never really trust me, but yeah, I mean, and I'm guilty of it too. Like where I provided value that at least value I thought without actually fully testing it out, and it was a problem. So I can understand that. I mean, we've all been guilty of committing a fix, saying it's not a problem, commit, push, go home, and you're like, oh, you look at it and you're like, oh, of course this is
Yeah.
broken. I spelled something wrong or whatever, right? It happens a lot.
I mean, look, I think fundamentally, like, I'm trying to build something huge. And so everything sits on a spectrum, right? Where, like, there's always a risk reward ratio for every release of any particular thing. And a big one of that is factored in is like, would somebody who hits this problem obviously find it in, like, who hits a problem with this code, obviously discover it in basic testing, right? And that code is frankly just less risky. So another example where it's not the case is like our calculation resolution logic, right? I'm much more rigorous about that because it could be subtly wrong and cause like subtle problems where the wrong piece of data is used in the wrong place. That code has to be treated, differently. But I think there's I think there's an aspect there too of like I have another like 10 years of work to do to make Ash what it can be. So I cannot quibble over everything too much. I just adjust my methodology and my practices to account for different risk reward profiles, right? So the reason for that is first trying to get Ash off the ground. I was much more interested in showing what the holistic system would be capable of than shoring up every invariant of the thing. And then that worked. Like people saw the potential, and then people started relying on it for business. And we had to change our strategy. We had to start focusing a lot more on stability across releases and on bug fixes. And so I think, like, to your point, Alan, like there's, you've been using Ash for quite some time. And so you've seen, most people who use it today, they don't, when they encounter a bug, it's like the one bug they encounter, they notice it, they report it, and it gets fixed, and they kind of move on with their lives. But there's people who've been around for the early scrappy days where there were, horrible documentation, bugs with basic stuff, and so it seems like it's just kind of an interesting thing. I think that like over time as we adjust, our priorities have to shift, and I've come to terms with that. Like I've gotten comfortable with even a good example is I am so busy now. I have my job is very very busy. I have a new job, and it keeps me busy very often. And sometimes I have to do something that on like a personal level I literally hate doing. But I have to be very like light touch where I would have been very involved before. So somebody will open an issue, I'll scan it and I'll say, I think that's not quite right. And I'll post a comment. Right. And then they'll say, that doesn't really make sense. Like your comment isn't really right. Like, can you like re-review the thing that I said? And then I'll come back and I'll, you know what? Yeah, that's true. I didn't really read that like fully, or I didn't understand what they were asking or whatever it is, right? Whereas before I used to engage like really really deeply with every interaction, and I try to do that as much as possible, but sometimes I just don't have time. And I've found that keeping the conversation going ultimately is better. Like like I don't know. There's just I respond to like 100 GitHub things a day. You know what I mean? So I've just had to like accept that like some corners get cut and other people have to pay that price. And that's what it comes into like building a community project. I think when you're building something that thousands of people use, I don't feel bad about sometimes putting the mental burden onto other people. Like it's just again, it's kind of the economics of it.
I think this is the one time where the guest has talked quite a bit, and also me too. Maybe you brought out something interesting for us. Usually it's Francesca bringing out quite a lot of experience, so it's good.
Brilliant. Well, experience goes both ways.
Yeah.
So just to wrap up, you introduced Ash AI at ElixirConf EU or Europe in Krakow. Will we see you speaking at ElixirConf in Europe in Malaga this year?
Yes, sir. I will be there. I'm actually giving a talk that has been rejected at other conferences before, and I'm excited that it got accepted because I think it's actually just a really powerful way to use Ash and Open together. So the conference is about modeling the work, and basically it's this like really cool pairing between Ash and Open. that I use to drive millions of jobs a day. Like we do like so much volume and traffic through this in a way that still keeps our domain logic clean and accessible and stuff. So anyway, I'm just really excited to finally give this talk, because I think on the face of it, it may sound like we're just talking about sort of background jobs, but in reality, we're talking about like a system that I've used that is like the beating heart of pretty much every project and business that I build at this point. Is this like really excellent combination between Ash and Open.
Looking forward to seeing you there. It's been a while.
I think that we should definitely bring you on one more time, sometime in the future, to talk about Igniter, because that alone is a whole nother beast. I would love to actually hear more about it, because I just know a little bit. But the fact that so many projects, even Phoenix LiveView has brought it into, the fold. Open is what you just talked about. They also have a way to install stuff. So that could be interesting. Otherwise, I have nothing else about Ash on my side. Do you have anything you
Cool.
wanted to
Well,
say
I really
before?
appreciate you guys having me.
I was gonna say, do you have anything you want to say before we leave?
No, I just, it's always a pleasure talking to both of you. I appreciate you having me. Excited for to listen to the podcast. I don't know if the first episode's released, but when it is, I'll be your first listener. I'll grab the popcorn and enjoy.
Oh, now you
You
have
can
two
find on
episodes to listen
YouTube.
to. We have the first one, which was 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, something like that, and then today, just today,
Oh,
there was one. I'll share it to
We're
you.
awesome.
trying to release
Great. That's
weekly.
awesome.
Yeah, we're trying to release weekly on Fridays, and see if we can keep up with that schedule. Just for the record, this podcast was recorded on March 13th, 2026. Friday the 13th. Woohoo.
Yes, exactly. I was a little bit nervous about this podcast. Zach, did you know the reason why you picked on Friday the 13th?
No, but now that you tell me it's Friday the 13th, I'm like nervous. I'm about to give a company all hands speech in like 2 hours. So now you've got it in like bad juju or something. I don't know. Uh-oh.
You'll be fine.